Hey, Jeremy Hammond here, and in this video, I want to talk to you briefly about flu shot propaganda. Fall's rolling around, the leaves are changing color outside my window, and that means it's flu shot propaganda season. And we're being bombarded with all this propaganda. Go out and get your flu shots, get your flu shots. So I just want to look at one quick example with you and show you how you're being lied to, and just blatantly lied to. And journalists aren't doing journalism. They're doing public relations for the vaccine industry and for the government. So let's take a quick look at an example here. So here's the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. All right. This is October 11th, 2019. Oh, that's today's date. The date of the article is, well, it's an editorial. It was just published October 5th, so a few days ago. All right, here's what they say. They start out, it's not too late, it's not too soon for a flu vaccine. And it's a little early in the season yet, but it's not too soon for a flu vaccine. And they talk about how the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, recommends that you get vaccinated during October. They say that might be the best time to get a flu shot. This year's vaccine, designed to fight the 4 strains of flu virus the World Health Organization has identified as the biggest threats, will include strains of the evolving H3N2 virus, responsible for most flu-related hospitalizations last year. This is important. That's why I highlighted it here on the screen. So this year's flu shot will include the strains of the evolving H3N2 virus responsible for most flu-related hospitalizations last year. Keep that in mind. Down the page, I talk a little bit more details about it. And then down here, I'm going to read this whole section. This is important. Debating when to get a flu vaccine is better than debating whether to get one. Everyone who can be vaccinated should be vaccinated. Excuses for shirking one's responsibility to get vaccinated aren't generally very good. A flu shot is relatively painless and convenient. It's also often free with many health insurance plans, and because some people, including newborns and those with some serious health issues, cannot safely be vaccinated, it is up to the rest of the population to get flu shots and create the herd immunity that protects everyone. It should be an annual errand for most of us, yet less than half of all American adults get the vaccine each year, according to the CDC. Well, there's one good sign. That shows you that most Americans are smart enough not to fall for this kind of crap. This is complete and utter garbage. This is propaganda. It's not journalism. Okay, so remember what they said there about this year's vaccine will include the strain of H3N2 virus that was responsible for most flu-related hospitalizations last year. Well, let's have a look at that. So they're telling you, this is why you need to get the flu shot. It's going to protect you, right? Well, what happened last year? Let's look at last year. Let's look at the last season. What happened? Well, here's an article on the health website Stat by the Associated Press. Look at the title, Flu Vaccine. This is from June 27th of this year. So, this summer, after the flu season had ended, flu vaccine no match against bug that popped up near end. What are they talking about? They're talking about that strain, that specific strain of H3N2 that rolled around the second half of the flu season, the past flu season. And the vaccine wasn't effective against it. So rolling down the page, they call it virtually worthless. Last season's vaccine was virtually worthless. That's the AP's description, not mine. Virtually worthless. The vaccine effectiveness was estimated at just 9%. Okay, now this is what the AP is reporting, all right? Now, but the AP is also being a little bit deceptive here. All right, let me show you why. So they're acknowledging virtually worthless against that strain of the virus. Okay, let's look at the source for that. They're citing 9%. This is what they're citing here. This is a preliminary estimate of 2018-2019 seasonal influenza vaccine effectiveness against medically attended influenza from 3 U.S. networks. Okay, and I've got that here and. Got that downloaded from the website. You can see this is straight off the CDC's website, right? This is straight from the CDC. So this is what the AP article is talking about. This chart right here, adjusted vaccine effectiveness against influenza A H3N2. All right, this is for all those three flu networks that they're they're looking at. The CDC has these 3 different networks around the country that they look at to do vaccine effectiveness estimates. And so here's what it showed. This is what the AP was citing. This is the vaccine effectiveness, VE, 9% for H3N2. Well, that's not very good. That, in the AP's words, that's virtually worthless. But here's what they don't tell you. So right here, they report the confidence interval. This is the CI here, 95% CI is confidence interval. And you'll notice that it includes 0, so -4 to 20. This includes 0. That means this 9% is not statistically significant. That could be completely due to chance. So in fact, it could be -4% effectiveness, right? I mean, that's within the realm of chance that it could be -4 effectiveness. So that result is not statistically significant. But let's roll down the page here and look a little more here. Look at this page. Adjusted vaccine effectiveness against influenza by age group and virus subtype. And this is with one of the 3 networks, the Haven network. And look at the vaccine effectiveness for H3N2. -60. And then when they adjusted that for potential confounding factors, they still came up with just -43% effectiveness against H3N2. That means if you got the flu shot last year, you were more likely to get the H3N2 flu virus infection. More likely, not less likely. It didn't protect. It wasn't protective. In fact, it increased your chances. Now, again, this was not a statistically significant result, but they talk down here. I'm going to go down the page right here. Let's see. So they acknowledge with all three networks. They say 3 U.S. networks identified no vaccine protection against predominant H3N2 virus this season. So the CDC admits no protection, 0. They couldn't. There's no evidence that it offered any protection at all against the H3N2 virus. None. And then they acknowledge there was negative vaccine effectiveness for H3N2 in adult inpatient networks. And and they said it could be related to chance or bias because there's a small number of cases. Why is there a small number of cases? Well, because they're talking here, they do these effectiveness estimates based on confirmed cases. The thing is they have these big estimates of how many people get hospitalized or die from the flu each year. We're told tens of thousands of people die each year and hundreds of thousands are hospitalized, but those aren't confirmed cases of influenza. The confirmed cases of influenza are actually very small. The number of confirmed cases of influenza on death certificates each year is a little bit more than 1,000. Okay, not tens of thousands, not 30,000, 40, 50. Last year they were saying it was 80,000 people died from the flu. Where are not on the death certificates? And so, and their reasoning behind it have all kinds of, there's a legitimate reason to say that, well, death certificates don't necessarily represent all cases of flu because a lot of people might die from flu and it's just not recognized. Well, that's true. So the CDC kind of guesses and makes up, it kind of does these mathematical models to try to estimate how many people actually die each year from the flu or how many people are hospitalized. They don't have actual data on that. They invent it through mathematical models. They have some data, and based on certain data, they kind of do these estimates. But they have these wild assumptions, So they include all respiratory illnesses, and they include pneumonia, with influenza, and they say, well, if you died of pneumonia, they consider that as possibly having been a complication from influenza, whether or not it's confirmed you had a confirmed influenza infection. Anyways, that's a whole other story. So here it is, the CDC acknowledging no effectiveness against that strain of the influenza H3N2. Now, but remember, let's go back to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette editorial. They're saying what this year they put that particular viral antigen in the vaccine, so you're going to be protected against it, right? Right? Well, here's another article on the Stat News website from September 30th, so just a couple weeks ago. Flu vaccine selections may be an ominous sign for this winter. Let me turn on my highlights here. Oops, there we go. All right. So let me dive into this a little bit. There's reason to believe, this is again, from Stat News. This is Stat News reporting here. There's reason to believe 2 of the 4 choices made last winter for this upcoming season's vaccine could be off the mark. So it goes into the explanation here of how they actually determine what viral antigens to put into the flu shot. Now, there's 2. This is the first thing you need to understand about the flu. Most of the time, people have the flu. It's not actually caused by the influenza virus. In fact, a minority of cases of what they call influenza-like illnesses are actually caused by influenza. So there's something like 200 known viruses that cause flu-like symptoms. The vaccine is designed to offer protection against 3 or 4 strains of influenza. But it's a moving target. Every year, the virus evolves so rapidly that it's a moving target. And so most of the time, so what the World Health Organization does is they have surveillance networks around the world, in North America, Europe, Australia, for example, and they look at what strains are dominating in circulation, and they make a guess of what's going to be dominating in the coming flu season. And guess what? Most of the time they're wrong, and they have what's called a mismatch between the viral strains in the vaccine and the viral strains that dominate in circulation. That's what happened last season. That's why the flu shot was, in the AP's words, virtually worthless against H3N2. So it's a moving target. They often miss. Most of the time they miss. And so what's happened this year is they said, well, okay, the H3N2, that was the dominant strain at the end of the last flu season. We're going to put that strain in this year's flu shot. But then guess what happened after they made that decision and that went ahead to manufacturing? Well, turns out it doesn't look like that's going to be the dominant strain in circulation this year. And so this is what this article is explaining. We'll go into more details of the article, but that's what they're talking about. So the flu vaccine selections may be an ominous sign for this winter, because guess what? It's probably not going to protect you, because the strain they put in there is probably not going to be the dominant strain. Now this brings us to another issue. Okay, so think about this. The World Health Organization makes a determination about what strains should be in the vaccine, and then they have a period of months to actually manufacture and distribute those vaccines and get them out there on the market for people to go get their flu shots. Well, that doesn't leave any time for randomized, placebo-controlled clinical trials to be done to determine whether that vaccine is safe and effective. So let me go back here to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Think about what they're saying here. Go out and get your flu shots. It's going to protect you against H3N2. They don't mention that actually last season's flu shot was completely worthless. They don't mention that it looks like actually that's probably not going to be the dominant circulating strain this year. So that's not going to protect you. And then they say that there's no good reason not to get a flu shot. No good reason. Well, I'll tell you what, here's one good reason not to get a flu shot right here. Okay, this negative 43% effectiveness. That's a good reason not to get a flu shot. It doesn't work. It's an ineffective vaccine. Now, sometimes they do get it right? Sometimes they do get it right. So let me give you a bunch more reasons not to get a flu shot, why it's reasonable for you to decide not to get a flu shot. And remember, keep this in mind also, they're saying that also you need to get the flu shot, not just for yourself, but to protect other people through herd immunity, right? Keep that in mind. All right, well, I've written a major series, article series, a major influenza vaccine expose. You can, right now it's 4 parts. There's a 5th and final installment of this series coming, and so you can read this right on my website, jeremyrhammond.com. So this is my homepage, and you can go ahead and just scroll down, almost halfway down the page, and you'll find the links to all of these articles. So let me just quickly go through a few more reasons, just a few. We're just going to scratch the surface here. We're just going to peel back one layer, all right, of why it's not a good idea to get a flu shot. So the first installment of the series I've written is called "Should You Get the Flu Shot Every Year? Don't Ask the New York Times." And so what I do is I cite this case study very similarly to this Post-Gazette article, which is an editorial and op-ed. But in this case, the New York Times actually had like a health news analysis type of piece. It wasn't just an opinion piece. It wasn't an editorial. But with the same message, go out and get your flu shot. There's no reason not to do it. The science says, it's effective against the flu, and it's very safe. And so I looked at what the New York Times said that the science says about the vaccine. And so here's what they said, and they cite a 2010 Cochrane meta-analysis, New York Times, citing a 2010 Cochrane meta-analysis. So they cite the study in the medical literature. Meta-analysis is a type of study where it's a systematic literature review. So they identify what it is that they want to study, to determine, have a question or a hypothesis they want to kind of look at, and they say, what does the science tell us? Not what does this study or that study tell us, because studies have conflicting results. I mean, you can cherry pick anything you want out of the medical literature to support an argument, but if you're going to ignore the preponderance of evidence, that's cherry picking. It's dishonest. So what a meta-analysis is they look at all of the data that's available. They search the literature for relevant studies, and they do this meta-analysis of what the conglomerate data are saying. And so that's what the New York Times is citing here to tell you to go out and get a flu shot. So they're citing this 2010 Cochrane meta-analysis. And this is a quote. So they say that this Cochrane meta-analysis showed that the flu shot confers a big payoff in public health. That's what the study, so according to the New York Times, this is what the science says, that the flu shot confers a big payoff in public health. An astonishing payoff in medical terms. Okay. So what I did is I clicked the link that they provided in that New York Times study, and I read the 2010 Cochrane meta-analysis. And so what I want to do is actually show you what that study actually said. So I need to activate my highlights here on the page so I can quickly find things. So here's some things that 2010 Cochrane meta-analysis actually found after doing this literature review. That under ideal conditions, and what that means is that the strains of the virus that they put into the vaccine match the circulating viruses. That's ideal conditions. That the vaccine is a match for the 3 or 4 strains. There's 3 or 4 depending on whether you get a trivalent or a quadrivalent vaccine. So under ideal conditions, it's a perfect match. 33 adults need to be vaccinated in order for 1 adult to receive a benefit from the flu shot. So in other words, 32 people out of every 33 who get the flu shot receive no benefit from it. Doesn't do any good. But you're essentially 32 out of 33 people are putting themselves at unnecessary risk of harm from the vaccine. Think about it that way. Okay. Now that's under ideal conditions. So what about under average conditions? Average conditions means normally in an average year, guess what? That moving target I talked about before that they usually miss, well, that's an average condition. That's an average condition year. So under an average conditions, 100 people need to be vaccinated to avoid 1 set of influenza symptoms. In other words, 99 out of 100 people who get a flu shot in an average year receive no benefit from it. Okay? That's what the science says. That's what the science says. That's what the New York Times own source actually says. Now, what conclusions do they draw from that? Do they say, well, that's a big public health benefit? We'll get to that in a moment. But first, remember what the Post-Gazette was saying here. You need to get a flu shot. It's your responsibility. It's your duty to get a flu shot, to protect others, to protect other people through herd immunity. You have to protect the babies through herd immunity. Well, here is what that same Cochrane review found with respect to the assumption. It's the CDC. That is one of the fundamental assumptions underlying the CDC's recommendation. Number one, that it reduces complications from influenza, so it will prevent hospitalizations and it's going to prevent deaths. And two, that it prevents transmission of the virus. Those are the two key underlying assumptions behind the CDC's flu shot recommendation. So here's what that same Cochrane meta-analysis found with respect to those two assumptions. There was no evidence that vaccines prevent viral transmission or complications. No evidence. So in other words, the fundamental assumptions underlying the CDC's flu shot recommendations are unsupported by scientific evidence. They're unsupported by scientific evidence. Okay. In fact, it's not just that. It's not just that. So the studies, the Cochrane collaboration, they did the search of the medical literature. They found all the relevant studies on these questions, and they found something else. They found that none of their studies, the studies that were included in their meta-analysis, even were asking the question of whether the central assumptions underlying the CDC's policies were actually true. They weren't even asking the question. They all just assumed that the CDC was right, and they never bothered to even study whether these things are true. And that's what that's what the science is indicating to us, that there's this institutionalized myopia, this institutionalized blindness, and this institutionalized bias. And in fact, and I'll continue down the page here. So this is part one again of my major influenza vaccine expose, and you'll notice here I've got references. You can just click the little reference number. It's going to bring you down to the reference I have, the citation to the medical literature. You can click the links and go and read these studies for yourself, assuming that some of them are behind paywalls and I've had to access them other ways. But a lot of them are just available. You can go to pubmed.gov. A lot of studies are available right online through a government website called pubmed.gov. So anyhow, let's continue here. We're talking about reasons. The media is telling you got to go out and get your flu shot. Science says you need to get a flu shot. Let's look at what the science actually says. Here's another thing. Same 2010 Cochrane review. Remember, this is the same study that the New York Times has cited last spring, to say you need to follow the CDC's recommendation and go out and get your flu shot. This is the study. This is what that same study actually said about the CDC's recommendation. Before we get to the CDC's recommendation, here's what they said about the science in general. All right. So they included 15 out of 36 trials were funded by industry. Okay. So industry-funded studies were published in more prestigious journals and cited more than other studies. So there's a bias there in the journals, the editorial decisions being made about what studies to publish. They tend to favor studies that are published that are funded by the pharmaceutical industry. That's an institutional bias. Studies funded from public sources were significantly less likely to report conclusions favorable to vaccines. So studies that are funded by industry, unsurprisingly, tend to favor their products. That's not a surprising bias. Continuing, reliable evidence on influenza vaccines is thin. Again, I'm quoting from this Cochrane meta-analysis. But, quote, there is evidence of widespread manipulation of conclusions and spurious notoriety of the studies. The content and conclusions of this review should be interpreted in light of this finding. So this review's findings were not very good for the flu shot. They were not very good. But they're warning you that even the benefits that they found, the very little benefits that they found, could just be the result of this institutionalized bias. And the types of studies that they do are mostly observational studies or retrospective observational studies. They just look at population data, which these types of studies are prone to what's known as selection bias. So they can't control for all the possible confounding variables with this type of study. To be able to do that, they need to do a randomized, placebo-controlled study, and they're not doing that. There's very few of them. And so overall, the quality, this is again quoting from that same study, the quality of the majority of influenza vaccine studies is low. So we're supposed to believe that the science is settled. Flu shot is safe, it's effective. Go out and get your flu shot every year. Do it for the babies. No evidence of that the vaccine stops transmission. And in fact, one study last year showed that vaccinated individuals are more than 6 times through their breath. They have more than 6 times as much aerosolized virus in their breath than unvaccinated individuals. So, in other words, assuming that the findings of that study can be confirmed, that's what the author said, that somebody else needs to kind of study this too and can confirm this finding. But that's an indication that actually vaccinated individuals are more likely to transmit the virus. Okay, and then we have this Cochrane meta-analysis saying that there's no evidence. Looking at the conglomerate data, when you add it all up, when you look at the big picture, the CDC's recommendation, the fundamental assumptions underlying CDC's recommendations are unsupported by scientific evidence. That's what the science is saying. All right, let's continue. So we're talking about how the industry funding of most of these studies, or a significant proportion of these studies, the ones that get the most attention, the ones that are published more, the ones that the media quote more, they have this bias. Then we come to the CDC. Again, we're told by the New York Times that, this is what the study is saying, that you need to follow the CDC's recommendations. Here's what the study actually says about the CDC. The content and results, this is a quote, the content and results of previous versions of this review have been extensively misquoted, especially in public policy documents. What are they talking about? They're talking about CDC documents. In fact, they go on to specifically identify the CDC document in which the CDC outlined its rationale for its flu shot recommendation. And here's what the Cochrane researchers say about that document. This is their conclusion. The CDC's, again, I'm quoting, the CDC authors clearly do not weight interpretation by quality of the evidence, but quote anything that supports their theory. End quote. In other words, the CDC just cherry picks data to support its policy. It ignores all the science that contradicts its policy. And then the CDC sends off, press releases to the media, which is exactly what you're seeing here. If we go back to our original article here, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette and the editorial board, the editors have just mindlessly taken probably some CDC press release, dressed it up a little bit with some fun language. It's certainly not too soon for a flu vaccine. Roll up your sleeve, they say. Roll up your sleeve, they say at the end of the article. So they just dressed up a press release from the CDC and passed it off as journalism. And that's typical. So let's continue. So again, CDC authors do not weight interpretation by quality of evidence. They quote anything that supports their theory. That's what the science is telling us. That's what the Cochrane collaboration has found in a systematic literature review. And here's their conclusion. Remember, again, the New York Times is saying that this study shows that the flu vaccine confers a big public health benefit. Here's their actual conclusion, that the findings of their study, quote, seem to discourage the utilization of vaccination against influenza in healthy adults as a routine public health measure. There it is. That's what the science is actually telling you, that the evidence doesn't support the CDC's recommendation. So does that sound like a pretty good reason to you not to get a flu vaccine? Because it does to me. It seems to me that the fact that the science doesn't support the CDC's recommendation is a pretty good reason not to follow it. But hey, that's just me. You could disagree. You can look at the evidence for yourself. Go look at the science for yourself. Don't just take the media's word for it, because they're lying to you. They're blatantly lying to you. They're not doing journalism. They're doing public policy advocacy. So just to head off one criticism that some people might take everything that I've just said and say, well, you're looking at that 2010 Cochrane review. Well, that's an old review. They've had subsequent reviews, right? Which is true. But they haven't significantly changed their conclusions in every review. In fact, they've kind of tossed up their hands and said, they keep doing all these worthless studies. We're not even going to look at those worthless studies anymore. We're just going to update based on, if the very few decent studies that they actually add, we're just going to update it based on that, because it's just a waste of time to look at all these crap studies all the time. That's what they're basically, basically saying with the most recent updates. But we can go through and look at real quickly. I'll try to keep this as quick as I can. Look at some of those subsequent reviews. So here's the one 2012 Cochrane review. This one was also quoted by the New York Times to say that it's very safe. It's very safe to get the flu shot. That harms from the vaccine are almost non-existent. That's what the New York Times said. Almost non-existent. Here's what that study actually said. The study that the New York Times quoted to support the statement that harms from the vaccine are almost non-existent. Well, that study actually found that for children aged 2 or younger, the perceived benefit was not significantly more efficacious than placebo. In other words, there was no good evidence that the vaccine is effective at preventing the flu in children under age 3. No benefit, no evidence that it's beneficial to children that young. So that's a pretty good reason not to vaccinate young children. But there's more. They found that there was no usable data, quote, no usable data on the safety of the vaccine for children under 2. Okay, again, this is a study that the New York Times is citing to say that that science has shown that the harms from the flu shot are almost non-existent. The actual conclusion was that in light of the known association between the flu shot and serious harms such as narcolepsy and febrile convulsions, so in light of such known harms, quote, it was surprising to find only one study of inactivated vaccine in children under 2 years. Given current recommendations to vaccinate healthy children from 6 months of age, that's the CDC's recommendation, so here's their conclusion, quote, if immunization in children is to be recommended as a public health policy, large-scale studies assessing important outcomes and directly comparing vaccine types are urgently required. So again, New York Times is citing the study to say that the harms, science has shown harms from vaccine are virtually non-existent. The study actually says that safety studies are urgently required because the CDC is recommending this vaccine for children, and there are no safety studies, there are no adequate safety studies showing that that is safe. Moving on, there's a 2014 Cochrane review, and they focused on the question of vaccinating pregnant women. The CDC recommends, so in the Post-Gazette, let's think about this, the Post-Gazette is saying to roll up your sleeve. That includes pregnant women. So if you're pregnant, the Post-Gazette is telling you to roll up your sleeve and get your flu shot to protect your baby. Well, is that safe for you? Is it safe for your baby? Well, here's a 2014 Cochrane review, and here's what they say about that. So the researchers found that the number of randomized controlled trials assessing the effects of vaccinating pregnant women was 0. 0. And the only evidence, this is so the CDC, when the CDC says that the flu shot is safe for pregnant women, they're relying completely 100% on observational studies with, quote, modest methodological quality. Observational studies, again, they're subject to prone to selection bias. So again, to really assess the risk and the benefits, what needs to happen is randomized placebo-controlled studies. They haven't done those. Now, quick caveat, just to preempt any criticisms here real quick, there are randomized placebo-controlled trials that have been done for influenza vaccines. They were done in developing countries. I think South Africa was one. I forget the other country where those types of studies or one of the, I think there's two, but those types of studies haven't been done. They're irrelevant to the U.S. population. They're irrelevant to the U.S. population. They bear no relevancy, so we can just ignore those. So speaking in terms of relevance for the U.S. population, there are zero randomized placebo-controlled trials assessing the risk and benefits for pregnant women to get the vaccine. Okay, let's continue. So this is the conclusion of this study. The results of this review provide no evidence for the utilization of vaccination against influenza in healthy adults as a routine public health measure. In other words, again, the CDC is recommending you get your flu shot. The science is saying there's really no evidence to support that confers a public health benefit. There's no evidence to support that. The CDC, I want to show you one way that the CDC lies to you. Okay, here's how deceptive they are. On the CDC's website, here's a quote. Flu shots this is the CDC saying the flu shot is safe. Here's what they say. Flu shots have been given to millions of pregnant women over many years with a good safety record. So think about what they're actually saying there in light of what the science says. All they're saying is that the safety of vaccinating pregnant women was never scientifically established prior to the CDC recommending it as a matter of public health policy. And nothing's jumped out at the CDC in post-marketing surveillance or observational studies as being obviously problematic to their assumption that this practice is safe. So in effect, all pregnant women who get a flu shot and their developing fetuses are the subject of a mass, uncontrolled experiment that the CDC is conducting by virtue of its public policy recommendations. Of course, one of the fundamental differences between a clinical trial and what the government is doing is that what the government, in the case of the government and public policy, the vaccine recipients have not given their informed consent to be experimented upon. This is the state of affairs. This is what's happening. You are being experimented upon. Now, does that sound like a pretty good reason not to get the flu shot? Just, I don't want to be a guinea pig. No thanks. I'll take my chances with the flu. Hasn't killed me yet. But wait, there's more. remember the negative effectiveness we looked at? So 43% negative effectiveness for the H3N2. Okay, it turns out studies have shown that getting a repeated annual flu shot every year, and I don't want to make this video too long, so I won't get into details. I won't get into the studies, but you can read the whole series on my website. I just took you through just the first one, and what I've just shown you is just barely scratching the surface. There's so much more. There's so much more in terms of reasons not to get a flu shot. So you can go ahead and read the whole series. But just to mention one more quick thing. So, in terms of this H3N2 strain of the virus that rolled around at the end of last season that caused so much, morbidity, hospitalizations and complications and things, and the flu was virtually worthless against. Okay, so studies have shown that getting a flu shot year after year, repeatedly, over time, the effectiveness of the flu shot wanes. So each year you get it, it's less effective than the prior year. So it has less effectiveness for you specifically because you've had prior vaccinations. So that's one thing. In fact, I think that was a CDC-funded study, if I'm not mistaken. You can find out whether that's so or not by reading the article. I just don't forget, and I do mention. Other studies have shown that getting a flu shot every year, it can actually increase your risk of getting not only the flu, but also other upper respiratory illnesses. So even other illnesses that are not even caused by influenza. How can that be? Well, it has to do with the difference between natural immunity and the vaccine conferred immunity. So we're supposed to believe that they just take a little piece of the virus or something and they put it in the flu into the into the vaccine, and then they inject it into you, and so you get kind of like a mild case of the disease. Well, in the case of a live virus, that's what they would say. In the case of the inactivated influenza vaccine, it's not a live virus. That it still stimulates an antibody response, so that when you are infected, that the antibodies will immediately attack that virus and destroy it, so your infection doesn't become serious. So that's the theory. That's the whole idea of vaccination. Well, the thing that ignores is that an antibody response is not the only type of immunity. So there's also something called cell-mediated immunity, and it's very, very important. If you want to have a healthy, functional immune system, you need to have cell-mediated immunity. And well, it turns out that natural infection confers a much superior immunity than the vaccine confers. Okay, the vaccine, it just doesn't do as good a job as your immune system acting on its own. And so, yeah, there are risks associated with getting the flu, but guess what the benefit is of getting the flu? If you're infected with one strain of the influenza virus, guess what? When your immune system, gets into gear and activates itself and fights that virus off, it not only benefits you against, not only protects you against that specific strain of the flu, but it also confers cross protection against other strains of influenza. And there's even a randomized controlled trial showing that it actually protects you against other viruses. So when you're infected with the flu, and the immunity you gain from that experience protects you against other viruses as well. So there's a randomized controlled study showing that actually getting vaccinated increases your risk of non-influenza illnesses. How can that be? Because you lost the opportunity to be naturally infected. You lost the opportunity to build that strong, robust immunity. And so when these other viruses roll around and you're infected, you have no protection against them. So you get sick. This is what the science is saying. And again, you can read the whole series on my website, jeremyrhammond.com. And, I cite the studies. You can click the links. You can go read the studies for yourself, and you see what the science is actually telling us about the flu shot. There's so much more. There's so much information that you're just not being told by the media because they're not doing their job. Just another thing to bring up. Another thing that obviously, either the New York Times or the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette are going to mention to you is that multi-dose vials of the influenza vaccine still contain mercury. They're still using thimerosal in flu shots. So thimerosal is a mercury-based preservative. It breaks down into ethyl mercury. It's about half ethyl mercury by weight. And ethyl mercury is a known neurotoxin. Okay, I'm quoting the Institute of Medicine here. It's a known neurotoxin that accumulates in the brain and can damage the nervous system. We know that. That's what the science says. That's what the Institute of Medicine has said in its own literature review related to, the risks of thimerosal and vaccines. And they want to inject this in pregnant women and children as young as 6 months. Another good reason not to get a flu shot? Well, if you are going to get a flu shot, at least do yourself the favor of going to the doctor's office. Don't go to Walmart or these pharmacies where they're probably more likely than not going to be using the multi-dose vials. At least get the single dose vials that are thimerosal free. At least do yourself that little favor if you are going to get a flu shot. It's just and the fact that think about this. The fact that the CDC, there's something called the precautionary principle, right? Precautionary principle. Why put patients at unnecessary risk of harm? Well, using a thimerosal containing flu shot puts pregnant women and their vulnerable developing fetuses. Mercury crosses the placental barrier. It crosses the blood-brain barrier. It gets into the brain. It causes neurodevelopmental harm. We know this. So it's an totally unnecessary risk for pregnant women to get a thimerosal containing vaccine. But does the CDC warn women to get mercury-free flu shots? No. Why not? Well, I'll tell you why they don't do that. Because if they were to do that, it would be an acknowledgement that, yeah, mercury is neurotoxic, and injecting it into your body involves risk. It's toxic. And they can't acknowledge that. The CDC cannot acknowledge that. Why? Because they have staked their reputation on the claim that thimerosal in vaccines is harmless. Why have they staked their reputation on that claim? Because back in the 1980s and 1990s, they kept adding more and more and more vaccines to their schedule. Many of those vaccines contained thimerosal. They never bothered to ask the question of whether it was safe to expose children to the cumulative levels of mercury that they were exposing children to. They never bothered to ask the question. And when by happenstance, the FDA did finally get around to doing the math, they determined that the CDC was exposing children to greater levels, cumulative levels of mercury that were greater than the Environmental Protection Agency's own safety guidelines. And they did it, and even that acknowledgement by the FDA that, yeah, we're overexposing children with mercury, but that was also deceptive too, because they said that, well, there's these other guidelines by the FDA and one other agency I don't recall offhand, and so the mercury levels were below those. They try to be reassuring. It was below those guidelines. Well, but the way they did that was that they took the exposure of mercury and they averaged out over the duration of the first 6 months of life or something. But that's not how the exposure actually happens. The exposure actually happens, this day you get the vaccine, your exposure jumps up, your exposure level it jumps up, and then, the body can eliminate some of the mercury over time. Some of the mercury is eliminated from the body, assuming your system is working proper, your system is functioning and you're actually able to eliminate the mercury. Some children cannot as well. Some children have genetic susceptibility that they're not as well able to detox. CDC doesn't consider that. It's so, you have these spikes. The day of the vaccination, there's this spike of mercury exposure, and then it kind of levels off, and then it does this. So if looking at the actual exposures, not averaging the exposure out over time, but looking at the actual exposures, the CDC was exposing children to cumulative levels of mercury that exceeded all of the government's safety guidelines, including the FDA's own. All right, and that's in my flu shot series too. All the documentation, it's all there. You can go and look it up and verify everything that I've just said for yourself. Okay, so that's why the decision was made to remove thimerosal around the turn of the century. They phased it out of vaccines starting, I think, in 1999 till about 2001, 2002. They phased it out. So today they say, well, there's no more mercury in vaccines. Well, yeah, there is. The flu shot still contains mercury. They recommend the flu shot for pregnant women. They recommend it for children as young as 6 months, even though there are no safety studies showing that this is safe to do for children under 2. Even though there are no safety studies showing that it's safe to inject pregnant women with, this substance. What the media say, science says. What the government says, science says. What your doctor says, science says. Because your doctor's just getting his information from the CDC. He's getting his information from the American Academy of Pediatrics, which is an industry-funded trade organization whose headquarters was built with vaccine industry money. Doctors don't know. Doctors don't go into the medical literature and spend hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of their time, hundreds of hours like I have, researching this and actually trying to determine what the truth is. They just don't do it. They have their careers on the line, first of all, and they're basically dictated to about how they practice medicine. There's no doctor-patient relationship anymore. It's government regulations are just dictating how doctors practice medicine. And it's the industry that have, has basically, there's so much corruption in the government that it's the industry kind of dictating how medicine is practiced. Doctors are basically drug pushers for the pharmaceutical companies. That's what it boils down to. And vaccines are a pharmaceutical product. It entails risk. Oh, here's another thing. Here's another reason why, it might be a good idea not to get a flu shot, because guess what? Because flu shots are recommended for children, all vaccines recommended by the CDC for routine use in childhood, the industry has no legal liability for those vaccines. So if you're injured by if a child is injured by one of those vaccines, and and the parents want to sue, they can't. There are very narrow criteria in which they can sue. They're basically, if the pharmaceutical company commits fraud by lying in the package insert, which is supposed to list all the warnings, which, by the way, the flu shot, if you read the package insert for the flu vaccine, it says right in there, no safety studies have been done for pregnant women. Okay, so CDC says, yeah, it's safe, go get your shot. Vaccine manufacturers saying there's no science saying that that's safe. Okay, it's right in there. It's right in their package insert. Go look it up. I don't know why journalists can't do that. I know the editors of the Post-Gazette can't go look at a package insert. They can't do the least amount of research. They can't do the least amount of journalism. Anyhow, the manufacturers have no legal liability because in 1986 the U.S. government passed a law granting broad legal immunity against vaccine manufacturers and they established what's called a vaccine injury compensation program, which is funded by an excise tax on each dose of vaccine. So what the law effectively did was to shift the financial burden for vaccine injuries away from the pharmaceutical companies and onto the tax-paying consumers. And these are the people we're supposed to trust with our health. These are the people at the CDC, the FDA, these are the people, the public health officials. These are the people we're supposed to trust with our health. We're supposed to trust them to make decisions for us. And we're not even supposed to think about it. We're not supposed to think for ourselves. We're not supposed to do our own research. We're supposed to just step in line, roll up your sleeve, get your flu shot. And the media are just compliant with this, and they're not doing journalism. They're doing public policy advocacy, and I've already hopefully shown that. Hopefully you agree. I've just shown that incontrovertibly. There's a lot more evidence to support what I've just said in my flu shot series. So go ahead, go to my website, jeremyrhammond.com. Right now, it's right on my homepage, and you can scroll down about halfway down my homepage, and you'll see the links to all 4 parts. And go ahead if you want to know. Basically, it's everything you ever wanted to know about the influenza vaccine, but the CDC didn't tell you. So go ahead to jeremyrhammond.com and check out that series of articles. Also, be sure to go to jeremyrhammond.com/FDA and sign up for my mailing list. I'm always sending out good information about vaccines and how you're being lied to, how the government and media are blatantly lying to you about the safety and effectiveness of vaccines. So go ahead and sign up for my mailing list so you can stay up to date and empower yourself with important knowledge that you're not getting from the New York Times or the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette or the Washington Post or any of the other mainstream media organizations. When you do sign up for my newsletter, you'll also get this free report explaining about the FDA vaccine approval process, some of the many problems with that process, and why just because the FDA says, it's got that FDA stamp of approval, just because it says FDA approved doesn't mean it's safe. Excuse me. So go ahead, jeremyrhammond.com/FDA, get yourself on my mailing list, and let's get involved here, because the public needs to know the truth about these things, and you can help. And in my newsletters, I talk about ways that we can all work together to get this truth out and combat the propaganda. That they might have the big loud voices, they might have the big platforms, they might have the billions and billions and billions of dollars in resources. I don't have those resources, but I'm doing what I can to get this information out, because it's just so important for people to know the truth about what the science actually says. And you can help. Get on my mailing list, jeremyrhammond.com/FDA, and join the fight. Join the fight for health freedom and the fight to get the truth out to the American people and to the world. This is really important. So hopefully you enjoy this video, and I'll see you soon.